Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents Seeing Red, Russian Propaganda and American News by Sarah Oates and Gordon Neil Ramsay. Read by Emily Durante. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and ebook formats of the book. 1. Introduction. Donald Trump could be the greatest gift to the Russians in the history of propaganda. This is not because of evidence that Russians held secret information on him or manipulated him through some undetected network. Trump became a foreign asset because he produced both words and actions that could be used to attack democracy, a key strategic goal of the Russians. Trump consistently denies reality, vilifies the free media, and broadcasts disinformation. This opens the door for foreign disinformation to flow into the U.S. news, hidden in plain sight by Kremlin-style rhetoric from a U.S. president and amplified by the right-wing media. Through the 2020 election, the Stop the Steal conspiracy, and the Capitol Insurrection, Russians found myriad ways to publicize the end of American democracy and the rise of Russia. The convergence of strategic narratives from a U.S. president and the Kremlin created historic opportunities for Russian information warfare. While Russian propaganda may have less opportunity to profit from the war in Ukraine, the struggles of U.S. democracy and traditional media empowered Russia's global narrative for the massive invasion in 2022. This elevation of Russian soft power could not have happened without Trump, who has been aided and abetted by politicians and U.S. outlets that favor propaganda over information. The threat of Russian disinformation is real, and it played a significant role in the 2016 U.S. elections. Despite knowledge of the risk and resourceful work by analysts and journalists in tracking down Russian propaganda in the United States, the problem of foreign disinformation continues to this day. As this book will demonstrate, this is in part due to exploitation of the American tradition of free speech and the open nature of the U.S. media system. The much more dangerous menace lies not in how foreign governments attempt to manipulate the media, but in how our media system has been compromised by domestic actors who follow an authoritarian playbook. When it is hard to tell the difference between what the Russians are saying about the Democrats and how Fox News is covering Joe Biden, it is time to realize that some U.S. outlets have crossed the line from news to propaganda. These forces came to a head again on January 6, 2021. Trump's manipulation of the media, honed over years of creating narratives that resonated more with myth-making than democratic reality, played a central role in the assault on the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters, seeking to overturn his loss in the 2020 election. Just as the Russians learned to seed disinformation narratives over the years, Trump deployed classic tactics of propaganda. He began projecting the narrative of a stolen election in 2020, months before the vote, as his support in the polls fell amid the expanding COVID pandemic, taking the extraordinary step of preemptively refusing to accept election results that were not in his favor. With his powerful pulpit, unquestioningly supportive right-wing media, and devoted following, he summoned his supporters to Washington and told them to march to the Capitol and fight much harder. Trump's post-election propaganda campaign had one immediate goal: to keep him in office. But its deeper, more important purpose was to delegitimize his opponent's victory, establishing a tactic adaptable to any future election, and thus undermining American democracy. A crucial element of this strategy was vilifying and disempowering the media, because journalists had the duty and responsibility to report on and expose Trump's lies. This matches a central goal of Russian propaganda: to take power away from the media. These tumultuous events, as well as Russian propaganda's recurring role in them, have come at a time when the U.S. media is consumed with its own deepening crisis. With the power of the Trump presidency and much of the Republican Party allied against the press, public trust in the media has declined. At the same time, the economic struggles of the U.S. media make them increasingly vulnerable to Russian attacks. The strategy many U.S. outlets adopted to survive, and indeed profit, in this period was to abandon the notion of objectivity and the independent monitoring of power to work in the service of Trump and propaganda. This is an exceptionally dangerous trend. Without professional news outlets, there is no truly free press. Without a free press, there is no democracy worthy of the name. The fusion of Russian and Republican propaganda in the news. This book illuminates how Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda themes, and tactics adopted by Republicans have come to colonize the information environment of the United States. It may seem like U.S. democracy successfully weathered its recent storms. The Capitol was cleared of the armed mob in a matter of hours. Trump left office in early 2021. Biden was sworn in peacefully, and candidates who echoed Trump's conspiracy theories about a stolen presidency largely failed in the 2022 midterm elections. The electoral system withstood an enormous test under a president who desperately deployed massive resources to try to overturn an election. He failed in large part because the courts, some with judges appointed by Trump, chose the law over political favoritism. But the threats to democracy have not gone away. As a society, we need to know our enemy. Russia is a classic foe of U.S. democracy. That's not only due to the historic rivalry and enmity between the two countries, but also because the U.S. serves as the primary target for Russian outrage over Western dominance in global political and economic affairs. The United States is Russia's enemy number one in its ongoing global information war. But the deeper danger to U.S. democracy is internal. Propaganda tactics that we recognize and understand from foreign information wars are now routinely deployed by domestic politicians on their own population. Yet, once we recognize these tactics, we can work to take away their power. This book addresses this ongoing threat. We demonstrate how our free media systems are infected with both Russian propaganda and U.S. news that echoes Kremlin talking points. From the appearance of Russian-generated text on the U.S. alt-right website InfoWars, to the amplification of crucial Russian narratives that resonate with the Trump administration on Fox News, and suggest ways to counter this danger. We also highlight where journalistic norms of balance and objectivity can sometimes work to amplify Russian propaganda. Why the U.S. media is vulnerable. At the center of this issue lies the peculiar institution that is the U.S. media. Both uniquely vulnerable and particularly powerful compared to counterparts in other liberal democracies, the U.S. media function under a commercial model that is quite different from corresponding systems in other countries. Almost all nations have significant state-funded media sectors, including major national television channels that are paid for with government funding. In theory, if not always in practice, these act to counterbalance media organizations that follow strictly commercial logics. U.S. media rely strongly on advertising to fund their operations, making the profession and practice of journalism far more vulnerable to market forces. This independence from a state-run media sector is viewed as critical to American democracy because it means the media can serve its citizen customers and not the powerful governments who fund state media. But this decentralized, liberal system with almost no government control and a strong tradition of free speech is also susceptible to manipulation. This is especially the case now that the audience engagement that draws advertising dollars is increasingly separated from high-quality journalism that functions in the public interest. The first big warning. The U.S. media's growing vulnerabilities, as well as the ability of both Trump and Russia to exploit them, came into sharp focus during the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign. Democratic contender Hillary Clinton was dogged by wave after wave of negative news coverage. Much of it came from the orchestrated release of her hacked emails that were published by WikiLeaks, news that directly competed with the Access Hollywood video that showed Trump bragging about assaulting women. In the fog of campaign coverage, it would seem that journalists were simply following the news. But later investigations revealed that Russian propaganda played a role in shaping coverage of Clinton and, by extension, influenced an American election. This was a glorious moment for Russians, who have felt marginalized by their country's loss of global status since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was a more confusing moment for Americans. Older citizens could remember dire warnings about Russian disinformation, but this was a distant memory mixed up with Red Scares and cartoonish propaganda from decades ago during the Cold War. For younger generations, it was just a puzzling part of a much broader political storm as Trump swept into the presidency against the odds. Why were Russians posing as Americans on Facebook and other social media? Why did the Russians appear to support Trump? Why did Trump appear to support the Russians? And what exactly was this Russian propaganda? And did it reach many Americans? It was clear that a Russia-influenced information war was now embedded in American politics. Yet U.S. action on this challenge was elusive. During the crowded and contentious 2016 Democratic primaries and into the general election, there was no organized response from the U.S. government to Russian propaganda. From 2017 on, despite an outcry against Russian meddling, congressional hearings, the Mueller investigation, and increased U.S. sanctions on Russian interests, there was little clarity or action on identifying and countering Russian messaging as it leached into the U.S. media system. A key feature of this information war was an attack on the notion of traditional American democracy and the amplification of a central strategic narrative that democracy is flawed and failing. This was the most successful convergence between Russian and Republican narratives, although the Kremlin also is able to use political division and right-wing media outlets to push its narrative that the West and NATO, with their unreasoning hatred of Russia expressed in what Russians call rampant Russophobia, are out to destroy Russia. This convergence sometimes makes it hard to distinguish Russian propaganda from U.S. right-wing rhetoric. Indeed, when doing research for this book, often we either could not tell the messages apart or discern whether Russian propaganda was recycling and amplifying Republican messaging. Was this a deliberate alliance in information warfare? No. While there are parallels between Russian and U.S. right-wing narratives, it's not particularly useful to search for a direct conspiratorial link between the two. The reality is much more complicated and far-reaching. It's much more beneficial to analyze scientifically how narratives from the Kremlin and narratives from the U.S. right align and dynamically influence one another. We began our research by using tools for identifying foreign propaganda hiding in plain sight in the U.S. media system. We found resonance between Russian and Republican narratives in campaign coverage of Biden, in the Stop the Steal conspiracy, and in the Capitol Insurrection. In these cases, the Russians were pushing at an open door, as Trump's rejection of traditional news and democratic values amplified propaganda narratives. We found that some important Russian propaganda campaigns, particularly against NATO and the Western military, found little traction in U.S. news until the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. However, we detected a pattern in elite U.S. media outlets of repeating Putin's talking points that blamed NATO for the invasion of Ukraine without always countering them by showing the Russians are the aggressors. As a deeply divided American public struggled to navigate political and social challenges under Trump, Russian propaganda attempted to disinform, disengage, and disillusion U.S. citizens. As this book will demonstrate, this strategy is part of a major information war aimed at weakening the United States as the primary enemy of Russia. Foreign propaganda is most effective at driving wedges into existing political and social fissures. That's much easier if the domestic media are recycling and amplifying the messages. As Marlene Laruelle points out, it is not that Russia can transform American society, but Russia can act as an echo chamber for American society's own doubts and transformations. In this scenario, it is often difficult to know if the negative coverage about American democracy is coming from RT, formerly Russia Today, or from Fox News. Our research shows how Trump's constant attacks on the free press, embraced by many on the U.S. right, gave an unprecedented opportunity for foreign adversaries to attack the country at a vulnerable time. This book analyzes the Russian influence on U.S. national news narratives at 4 crisis moments in American and global politics: the divisive 2020 U.S. presidential election campaign, the Stop the Steal conspiracy, the 2021 Capitol Insurrection, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Russia is not the only foreign adversary infiltrating U.S. media, as China in particular actively carries out propaganda campaigns. However, by using our in-depth knowledge of Russian propaganda, we outline an effective way to detect and deter foreign propaganda in the U.S. media in general. Americans can and should know if the source of what we read, watch, or listen to is coming from Washington or Moscow. We explain how to track disinformation back to its source to identify, deter, and even counter a key element in the erosion of American media freedom. Rising above the usual debates over fake news or attempts to claim foreign propaganda is easily isolated from U.S. journalism, this book uses powerful analytical tools to define and demonstrate where Russian-based narratives appear in the U.S. news. It also shows where Russian propaganda tactics are deployed by the U.S. right-wing media by looking at news narratives, which characterize how stories are told to support end goals. Understanding the history of Russian propaganda. Why and how would Russia make the United States its primary global target for propaganda more than 3 decades after the U.S.-Soviet superpower rivalry came to an end? This is both an echo of the Cold War and a reflection of current Russian realpolitik. During the Cold War, both nations had active propaganda campaigns aimed at championing their ideological values. All Soviet media was saturated with pro-communist propaganda. Indeed, the central purpose of the Soviet media was to support and promote the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The United States spent lavishly on American-produced public diplomacy aimed at the Soviet Union. This included Voice of America and Radio Liberty. The Soviet Union's collapse just 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall was seen at the time as a permanent global victory for Western ideals and way of life. Russia, however, did not embrace Western-style democracy, despite some flirtation with free elections and media. Rather, power was quickly consolidated in the hands of a group of oligarchs who also seized control of national assets to amass staggering personal wealth. Today, Russia is an authoritarian state that relies heavily on media messaging to control its population under the popular figurehead of President Vladimir Putin. He has been elected, with no viable opposition, enough times to have now ruled Russia for more than 2 decades. And a 2020 change to Russian law will allow him to stay in office until 2036. Putin's domestic influence is boosted by his response to external threats, both real and imagined. The founding of the Russian Federation in 1991 was marked by economic instability, rampant inflation, insecurity about neighboring states, and a long civil war in Chechnya. Russia was deeply angered by the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia during the Kosovo War in 1999, as the Western alliance proceeded with the strikes without authorization from the United Nations Security Council to evade a Russian veto. This was a significant signal to Russians about their lack of influence in their own neighborhood of Eastern Europe. Although Russians like to tell an uncomplicated narrative about NATO as a historical threat to Russia, there were times when Russian and American leaders even broached the idea that Russia could join NATO. But for Russia, NATO has come to represent its failure to find a dominant role in the world. Although NATO is technically a defensive alliance, for Russia it stands as an existential threat. Inculcating fear about foreign threats is a useful method to bolster public support of a regime that is unable to offer democratic choices to citizens or build a society free from rampant corruption. It is more expedient to manufacture consent by framing Russia as an encircled, embattled state that must protect the Russian motherland and her people from being overrun. At the same time, demonstrating the power of the Russian nation through limited wars in places as diverse as Georgia and Syria is a powerful driver of positive domestic public opinion. A rally round the flag syndrome is certainly not new or limited to Russia. Ratings for U.S. President George W. Bush soared after the 9/11 attacks and allowed his White House to craft a war on terror frame and launch the Second Gulf War. This changed U.S. politics and policy in ways that resonate to this day. So if using foreign threats or even limited invasions is not new, what is different about Russia's 21st century information strategy? It combines 3 elements that significantly amplify its traditional projection of power. First, Russia has shown it will savagely punish neighboring countries for even appearing to side with the West. This was seen in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Second, Russia uses its formidable media presence in the post-Soviet region to engage in massive propaganda campaigns. Third, Russia is leveraging current opportunities in the global media ecosystem, notably the lack of regulation of online and social media, to wage an aggressive propaganda campaign against a range of countries in the West. Its efforts in the information war against America are the focus of this book. While Russia can wield military threats or other forms of power in its own region, the object of its propaganda in the West is much more about undermining the narratives of U.S. superpower dominance and the virtues of liberal democracy. While it is willing to invade other countries, Russia also finds it effective to manipulate American hearts and minds to get a useful outcome to support the Putin regime. This can take the form of sowing chaos in an enemy state, or even managing to manipulate elections to get a candidate more sympathetic to the Russian viewpoint elected. In the case of Trump, Russia may have gained both in 2016. The 2016 U.S. elections. What the Russians learned. The Russian propaganda campaign in the 2016 U.S. elections must have exceeded the wildest expectations of its organizers. Although Americans were alarmed by the revelations that Russians had posed as Americans and bought political ads on social media, the evidence that the Russian-backed leak of Democrat emails may have influenced the U.S. news agenda at a critical time in the election is perhaps more worrying. At the same time, Trump was much friendlier to Russia, apparently easier to manipulate, and did not conform to the usual presidential caution in dealing with Russia, or indeed any foreign country. While it was unclear whether he didn't understand why he should be prudent with Russia, or he just didn't care, it benefited Russia to have a rogue president with a clear affinity for authoritarian leaders. Even the direct benefits of a Trump presidency, however, were not the greatest gains for Russia from the 2016 elections. With a relatively small investment in social media advertisement and a hack-and-dump operation that targeted the Democrats, the Russians were able to spook both American leaders and the public with an idea of a malevolent enemy with superior information warfare skills. It didn't matter that evidence remains very much mixed as to the exact impact of the Russian social media campaign on the U.S. vote. What matters is the specific fear that it inspired of Russia, which is inferior to the United States in both conventional military strength and global economic clout, as well as the idea that electoral democracy could be so easily subverted. To help get Trump elected over Clinton was a short-term win. To demonstrate that U.S. democracy is dangerously vulnerable is a far bigger victory. But looking at social media messaging alone, or a single operation targeting the Democrats, is far too narrow a lens through which to view Russian propaganda. It is neither just a few messages on social media nor a vastly powerful influence engine. Rather, Russian propaganda is funneled into broad and diverse media systems in the United States, sometimes resonating with the story, but mostly getting lost in the vast sea of media messages or overtaken by the next big moment in the news cycle. Although we often see Russian propaganda as attempting to influence specific opinions or events in the West, it's more productive to understand it from the Russian point of view. We need to view Russian propaganda as part of broader Russian strategic narratives that define and transmit the Kremlin's foreign policy objectives. At the same time, it's critical to understand the nature of the current U.S. media system so we can see how foreign messages enter our information sphere, how they are spread, and whether they resonate effectively in American society. The traditional mass media, online media sites, and social media networks all play a role. While Russian narratives have not been particularly compelling over time for the U.S. audience, America's current political polarization offers Russian propaganda a promising vector into the U.S. media ecosystem. Even foreign propaganda can be welcome if it supports your point of view. An asymmetric media situation between the West and Russia, one open with few restrictions, one much more controlled, also helps favor Russian information warfare over Western civil discourse. Trump's approach to information control is closer to Russian tactics than to traditional American political messaging. Classic Russian propaganda tactics include obfuscating, denying facts, lying, attacking critics, defaming others, and illogically shifting blame to specific groups in society, such as immigrants or liberals, etc. An additional central element of the Russian propaganda playbook is attacking the media and journalists. A quality that both Putin and Trump share is the ability to play on conservative fears and values, to promise that traditional values matter and will triumph over liberalism. Trump stood apart from previous U.S. presidents, many who did reprehensible things while in office, by fully embracing propaganda over reputable political communication. Plan of the book. This book examines three critical parts of the foreign propaganda equation. On the one hand, We document the efforts by Russians to project their national needs and desires onto the U.S. media ecosystem through their international outlets, such as RT and Sputnik. We analyze the stories the Russians wish to tell and the image they...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?